Ladies and gentlemen, could I welcome you to Queen's College? My name's Stuart Gill. If I hadn't met you, I'm the Master, Head of College here at Queen's. And a couple of years ago, we actually launched something called the Sugden Institute. And people have been saying to me, this is a relaunch. It isn't technically a relaunch because we continue to do stuff on Zoom. But it's wonderful to actually be back in this room almost 2 years later. And it's a kind of repeat performance, but with different people in the place. And hopefully with an interesting conversation this evening. So different people, except for Dan and myself. Although I noticed that Jim McCluskey's here, and Jim was part of the original occasion. And a different time as well, in terms of it being post-COVID. But let me, for a few minutes, just reflect upon this issue of place. As we come together in this place, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the lands, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And our Vice-Chancellor, Duncan, who is going to speak in a few minutes, always makes the point that this is important in this location because people have been coming together for thousands of years to share knowledge and wisdom together on these lands. We've got a portrait of Queen Victoria up there that sort of represents the time when this college was founded as Queen's College. It's behind you. People were meeting here for thousands of years before that to share knowledge. And I think one of the most exciting things that I've seen in recent days, we've got Professor Marcia Langton here with us this evening, was to hear Marcia speak a week or so ago at the Graduate School of Education about the project in Indigenous knowledge that the university's involved in. And this is certainly something that we're very passionate about within this college and other colleges as well. So we acknowledge our First Nations people this evening as we come together. Let me just take a minute or so to talk about why the Sugden Institute. As we were thinking of the college, a few of us, 2 or 3 years ago, and particularly for founding master, and you'll see a little bit of a description about this in the flyers that we have on each of the chairs. Our founding master was one of these infuriating people in the 19th century who dabbled in all kinds of areas. He was a theologian, but he was also a scientist. He was interested in music. He was interested in all kinds of books and writings, particularly Shakespeare. He ended up with a doctorate from the University of Melbourne for his work on Shakespeare. We've got his music collection here. We've got his baton from conducting choirs. He was the chair of what became Melbourne University Press. He was involved in the art gallery. I don't think he ever slept. He was also the master for a long, long time. And therefore, I think it was appropriate that the Institute's named after him because it's about the engagement between town and gown. And he was certainly very engaged in the town, and the University of Melbourne, from the beginnings, has always been very engaged in the town. In the previous flyer that we put out, a friend of mine at the University of Toronto, Professor Paul Gooch, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Course Correction, a Map for the Distracted University. And just that title, I think, is a challenge to us as we come out of COVID. But what he was speaking about was the importance of the public square. And he spoke of how, if you look at a place like Helsinki, how the Lutheran Cathedral was across from businesses within the public square, from government and from the church. University enclosed the town square, expressing architecturally the conversation and commerce between and among parties. It was where people came together to discuss big ideas to make a difference in their community. John Goddard, the Vice Chair of UQ's Civic University Commission and author of the Civic University, the Policy and Leadership Challenges, says that civic engagement or service and collaboration with the local population needs to be embedded into the mission of an institution. It needs to be embedded into the teaching and the research, and it needs to be owned by the leadership. That's what we're trying to do through the Institute, and that's what I believe the University of Melbourne does every day as well. And what the Institute is trying to do is to be in partnership with different groups that are also engaged in this process. As we think of tonight then, we've got a number of representatives here from different aspects of Melbourne society. I had hoped to have the politicians represented, and previous time we had our local Green MP, who is actually a Wyvern, Ellen Sandell, and I did also invite Sally Capp to get involved. Our politicians are working tonight, I believe, so Parliament was sitting, so Ellen had to pull out, and I was told that Sally was chairing a meeting tonight as well. But one of the things that Ellen said last year at one of our online meetings that we had was, she spoke about the city of Melbourne, how important culture was and how important culture would be as we emerge from COVID. And so it's wonderful this evening that we do have people on the panel who represent that very important part of what Melbourne is, and that indeed our business community actually supports as well. Within my own board, I've got a member of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra board here as well this evening. And so that interaction, again, within our community. I do have an apology from Jane Hemstridge, who we'd hoped would be here this evening as part of the panel, but unfortunately has succumbed to COVID. And this morning she contacted me to say that she couldn't be with us. I'm delighted that we have got Claire Spencer with us, and this must be one of your last sort of engagements here in Melbourne. Claire has changed the course of the Arts Centre in Melbourne, and we had an interesting conversation just earlier on this evening about the fact that she's a theologian, and you don't find many theologians in these parts, particularly working in the Arts Centre. You do here at Queen's, because originally we were a theological college, and I was delighted to hear that, Claire. I think it's a very undervalued discipline in terms of understanding humanity and understanding the world. But you achieved that at Cambridge, which is very dear to our Vice-Chancellor's heart as well. But you also have a background as a chartered accountant, so you're sort of holding these two things in tension. So we look forward to what you're going to share with us this evening, and we look forward to what you're going to do in London as well when you go back to the Barbican. We also have Michele Levine with us this evening. I've known Michele for some time through my friend Gary Morgan and Roy Morgan at Gallup polls, and one of the leading, if not the leading, polling company in Australia. And as we think of these issues, and Michele also has a background in the cultural area, having chaired, I think, the Malthouse Theatre, but as we think of these issues, it's good to know what people are thinking in different areas in Melbourne society. So after Professor Duncan Maskell has spoken, we'll invite the panel up under the capable Q&A time with our good friend Dan Ziffer. We don't have any bankers here this evening, so I think everyone's safe. Dan, of course, is well known for his book, A Bunch of Bankers, looking at the Hayne Commission. But he's also very familiar with these grounds as he was a student here. So welcome back, Dan. And it now gives me great pleasure to invite Duncan, but I will just say a couple of words about Duncan. Couldn't think of anyone better to lead off the discussion this evening. Experienced not only as a world-class academic, researcher, Cambridge, working in Oxford, Imperial College London, but also someone who understands the business world, who has been involved in biotechs, has had an entrepreneurial career, founding a number of companies. As we think of the last couple of years, Duncan, here in Melbourne, I'm sure it's not the kind of university that you expected to run, because I know you're passionate about engagement with students and face-to-face interaction. You've done an outstanding job. I think you've brought all the qualities of your background to be able to keep the university on that right track and not to become distracted. And I don't think we could have asked for anyone better during this period of crisis. Over the summer, I was reading the diaries of Raymond Priestley, who was another Cambridge man who was here in the period of the 1930s, only for about 3 years, but he actually put Melbourne on track to become the university that it is today, I think, in many of his aims. He had a good Queensman working alongside him called John Frederick Foster, who I'm interested in. But he did a terrific job. I think you're doing a wonderful job, and we look forward to what you're going to share with us this evening to start what I think might be a very interesting conversation. Please welcome Duncan Maskell.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Very kind words indeed. Thank you. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and learn, and I pay my respects to Indigenous elders, past and present, and I acknowledge all Indigenous people who are here this evening. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thank you so much for inviting me. Before I start, I just hope you don't mind if I sort of go off message from the title I was given for this a little bit, but that's my privilege, I guess, standing here. I'm really delighted to be part of this I was going to say relaunch, but maybe we should call it resurrection or renaissance of the Sugden Institute. Named, of course, after, as we heard, after Edward Holdsworth Sugden, the first master of the college and a true-born Yorkshireman. We should really, therefore, call him Sugden, incidentally. He was trained for the Wesleyan Church at Headingley Theological College in Leeds. But sadly, this was some 15 years or so before the famous cricket ground was opened there. So very sadly, he wouldn't have been spending his spare time in that most precious of activities, watching cricket in the freezing Yorkshire cold. And he certainly wouldn't have had with him some warm beer in his hand, given his faith, I guess. Anyway, this is the Institute's first face-to-face event for a couple of years. I have found, as Stuart alluded to, the lack of face-to-face contact with people very hard to endure during these past couple of years. And my heart really rejoices at being able to reconnect now with people at the university and in our colleges, people in the city and people in our country towns. And as soon as we were allowed out, I've been around and about all over the place, and it's been great to start reconnecting with people. Walking about the campus, there really is great energy about the place again. And I have been accosted more than once by students who wanted to inform me of my inadequacy of thought about some of the controversies of the day, about which they, of course, are convinced that they are right. It's really great to be getting back to normal. Anyway, I'll start by saying something that should be obvious to anyone observing the world at the moment, and namely that is that we are living in a time of constant change. This, of course, is nothing new. As far back as Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher of the 6th century BCE, the theme of constant change or flux, sometimes rendered as becoming, has been a staple of Western thought. It's also a staple of all sorts of other thought systems as well, of course. Heraclitus famously said that when you step into a river, the water in the river constantly changes around you, but the river itself stays the same. Pantarei, or everything flows. Certainly, when we look at the world over the past couple of years, the metaphorical waters in the river have changed a very great deal. I think we might observe how from a completely COVID-focused mindset in 2020 and 2021, the world has quickly become focused on a different crisis, the senseless and barbaric war in Ukraine. Almost no one is in favour of this war. From a brave TV presenter on state-controlled Russian TV who held up a sign opposing the war, to anti-war protesters in at least 37 Russian cities, to Russian tennis players who continue to play in tournaments but refuse to do so under the Russian flag, right through to the united opposition, of course, of the Ukrainian nation, as well as united support for Ukraine from the international community. The war has no support really from anyone except Putin, his close disciples, and those poor people in Russia who have been misled by Putin's Soviet-style propaganda and his fear campaign. This war has produced the gravest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Thousands of civilian deaths and the prospect of escalation, including the threat of nuclear weapons being used against human beings for the first time since 1945. We've even heard an incumbent United States president explicitly warn of the dangers of World War III should Putin cross the NATO border. It's not my intention to be doom and gloom and spread alarm on this. Everyone knows that the situation is serious, and as always in human affairs, there is hope. Ukrainian and Russian government negotiators are still talking. The strong international support for Ukraine may deter Putin from further escalation. Potentially, even if it seems unlikely at this moment, peace might return as quickly as it came, as quickly as war came. And the world could turn its mind to problems of a different kind. In other words, the waters in the river of history can and will change again, and this can happen very quickly. Climate change, for example, is never far away from our minds and could come roaring back into the headlines with the next major flooding event or bushfire season. Racism and intolerance of diversity are constant major challenges for nations and communities everywhere. There are many other persistent world problems that receive fewer headlines but demand attention as well. They include the stubborn problem of statelessness, people with no nation that they can belong to, of whom there are an estimated 10 million in the world today. That is on top of the aforementioned refugees, of course, people who have a nationality but cannot return home at the moment because of one problem or another, like war or famine. Refugees represent an even bigger world population, and their numbers keep growing, as we have seen in recent weeks. So having painted this possibly bleak picture of the here and now, I contend that challenges in the world are not essentially different from the way they have been throughout the long run of history. I think there is value in seeing all such events, COVID-19 during the past 2 years, even the Ukraine war today, as forming part of the constant flow of history. As university people, but also as citizens, we can benefit in every moment from holding clearly in our minds a longer-term view of history and of crisis, and of conflict and of challenge. Not just focusing on the water that is flowing around us in the moment, but seeing the whole river as well. I think that this is something that universities in particular should be able to do. Perhaps Stuart, as an historian, might agree or disagree with me here, but I do feel that's certainly something that universities should be very prominent in. So I think all of the things that are happening in our very uncertain times are matters that affect real people, where universities can and do have an important role to play, in finding solutions perhaps, but certainly in dissecting and explaining the issues, and in challenging governments and others to think harder about what is happening. Universities also have a very important role to play in asking fundamental questions about what it is to be human. Not everything is about problem solving, not everything is about making money. Trying to understand what it is to be human and how we live in the world, I think is an incredibly powerful contribution that universities make. So meeting here at Queen's College at the University of Melbourne on a March evening, I was going to say a beautiful March evening, but it's maybe a little less than beautiful tonight, in 2022. How should we think about this phenomenon of constant change, constant uncertainty, changing crises and challenges that confront the world and our communities. Well, the first thing that I would maybe say about what we can say from the vantage point of a university is that meetings like this series of Sugden Institute conversations are extremely important. A large part of my day is taken up with university management, of course, but it is the big picture of what universities do in and for the world and in people's lives that excites me, and also provides a foundation for everything that people in universities spend their time doing. I will allude to the thing that Stuart mentioned earlier about the Senate Square in Helsinki. It is a very beautiful spot, right in the heart of what is actually one of my favourite cities in the world. As Stuart said, that Professor Gooch talks about the south being near the sea with merchant houses, the east being the home of the state government, the west being the university, and the highest point of the city to the north being the Lutheran Cathedral. It's an extraordinary place where business, government, church and university are all in conversation with each other. A brilliant piece of architecture. I think it makes very clear, to me anyway, that universities are not luxuries that we can do without, but are core foundational institutions in society, and which in turn would do well to remember the fact, universities would do well to remember the fact, we in universities, when considerations of town and gown come into play. Aloof separateness is not the right answer for a university, in my view. I think that there's a further element in the Helsinki town square symbolism that could be emphasised, which comes from the mention of the sea, and which captures international commerce and interaction, on which the wealth of so many nations depended in the past and still does now. Helsinki and Melbourne are, of course, both port cities, as well as being university towns. Today, for us, as I'm sure it is for the Finns, the global dimension is absolutely vital, both for the city and for the university, and for the two in partnership as well. International trade is an important element in this, of course. So is international collaboration and research. We saw this exemplified in the efforts by researchers here at Melbourne, at the Doherty and in other institutes and departments, in collaboration with colleagues at institutions overseas, when the international research community quickly was able to develop the science in relation to the new coronavirus in 2020. And on this point, and I think it's very much too often overlooked, was the fact that the new vaccines, which have in a real sense saved us from the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least its worst effects, are the direct outcome of decades of truly international research collaboration across several disciplines, all directed at helping humanity, even if the research for many of those decades were at the very basic end of the spectrum. Other partners on the town square also contributed to this rapid vaccine development and rollout. Governments, which put up incentives to develop them. Hospital and healthcare teams that led the way in distribution and getting shots in arms. Community groups, which helped advocate for vaccine take-up. And in the face of some very ignorant scaremongering about how vaccines work. So, the town square image is very valid. I would only add the international dimension, or the global dimension to the model, to make it more complete, and perhaps a truer image of how universities and cities work together. They work by talking and partnering together, but also by looking out on the wider world with a view to making a difference out there. Another important global dimension of universities' work is in the area of public education and advocacy. Two relevant examples of this especially leap to mind for me at the moment, in relation to nuclear disarmament and to refugees. Both issues, sadly, have become prominent because of the war in Ukraine. So though the threat of nuclear weapons has not been as prominent in media discussions in recent decades as it was during the distant days of the Cold War, which some of us are old enough to remember, the fact is that the threat of nuclear war has never gone away. This has made the work of university people like Professor Tilman Ruff extremely important. Professor Ruff is an associate professor at the Nossal Institute for Global Health, and as a public health physician, he is well known for his work over many years towards abolishing nuclear weapons. His work has helped to establish the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, and ICAN was recognised with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. This is a direct contribution of somebody in a university to one of the world's major issues. In relation to refugees too, universities play a very important role, alongside other members of the community, in being a place where everyone is welcome, including those who literally have nowhere else to go. I was delighted and quite moved by the story of Khalid Admina from Afghanistan, who was enabled to join the university as a master's student in the Faculty of Arts this year. Both Khalid and his sister, who was a medical student, were forced out of Afghanistan after the Taliban took power last September. I also warmly applaud the work of Queen's College in partnership with the Faculty of Arts in supporting other refugee students and scholars at risk. Again, there is the brilliant story of Mohammed from Iran, who is now a second-year arts student on his way to studying law. I know Queen's is working hard to support Mohammed on this academic journey. I hope that in a couple of weeks you will be joined by another at-risk student of whom I'm aware, from Myanmar. I've done a lot of work in Myanmar, and it's a complex place, but there's a lot of good people there who are under the cosh at the moment in many ways. I wish you and her all the best as she takes up her studies here too. This is such important work because education is our mission. Pointing to the global dimension, our education is not to be the exclusive preserve of Australian students, but of people with potential, no matter where they come from. This is important for the whole world, not just for the local city and nation. It is greatly to the benefit of our city and nation that we engage so strongly at the international level, something that was mentioned actually by Minister Tian at an event at the Australia-India Institute this morning in the Old Quad. I'm going to end with a story of another refugee and a member of the Queen's College community, the late Sam Pizar. You may know the story, but Sam was a Holocaust survivor who narrowly escaped death at the hands of the Nazis as a teenager. Then in the 1950s, he was able to come to the university here and graduate in law while living at Queen's. A few weeks ago, the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who travelled to Melbourne for an international summit meeting, decided to visit the university while he was here. A great honour for the university. The reason was that Sam Pizar was Antony Blinken's stepfather and had had a huge positive influence on Blinken's life. Blinken was very touched when I was able to present him with a framed photograph of Sam that was taken while he was a student here at Queen's during the 1950s. I'm telling you these anecdotes because I want to get across the message to leave you with, which is the city and the university. They're full of stories like this. They're embedded in our joint past and in the history of the wider world. And sometimes these stories only surface because of particular events that pop up from time to time. They are reminders of the flow of history. They also remind us of the persistence of the university mission over very long periods of time and how that is embedded in the cities and societies of which our universities form an essential part. The mission clearly remains as relevant during the 21st century as it was in previous centuries. And it is a mission that works best only when town and gown unite with common purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. My name is Dan Ziffer. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. I'll bring up our... Please, if our panellists could please come... Apologies. If our panellists could please come up and join us on the stage. No, Duncan's coming as well. We do, yes, as Stuart mentioned, we have had some late scratchings. In fact, this evening's list looked very much like the inside back cover of the Herald Sun on about round 6. It was kind of shoulder, COVID, close contact. So it is wonderful to have all of you here and the panel that we have today. We have time to talk, we have time for your questions as well as mine, and time for the panellists to ask questions of each other as we explore these topics so well thought out by Duncan in that initial speech. I'll give you a quick break, so I'll start with Claire. Duncan made a point in the speech about the danger of aloof separateness in institutions. We have seen through COVID that two sectors in particular have been very much left to fend for themselves through very difficult times that were forced upon us for very good health reasons, the universities and the arts sector. How much do you think that perception, real or imagined, of aloof separateness has played into the result of how that support came in the past? What's been a very difficult 2 years.
That's a really interesting provocation. Look, I think the arts sector hasn't always done itself favour in how we've advocated the value that we add to the communities that we're all part of. And I think in part that's a result of very competitive funding environments at both a state and federal level, which unfortunately often have the effect of turning companies against each other in competition with each other. So one of the things that COVID did, I think one of the good outcomes from COVID is it actually brought us together as a sector and forced us to advocate as a sector. And that we had some good outcomes from that. With both federal and state support, not enough, I would suggest, but better than it might otherwise have been. But I think it did also make us stop and think, how do we remain relevant? How do we remain contemporary? And how do we ensure that we can shrug off that elite elite label that is often given to us? And certainly from a performing arts point of view, there was a lot of very quick pirouetting. We didn't pivot in the performing arts, we pirouetted. We pirouetted to digital, and partly that was about outreach and connection, partly it was about keeping artists employed as much as we were able. But what we found through that was a whole new audience, people in regional areas, people with disabilities who may not feel comfortable coming into our facilities. So there was quite a curious outcome from that, and certainly something that we want to keep going with. But it also, for us at the Arts Centre, it made us look inward before we looked outward, and really contemplate the community that we're here to serve. And so we've actually emerged from COVID with a new outlook and a new determination to be the Arts Centre for Victoria, not for just some of Victoria. And so you'll start to see in the coming months and years a different looking arts centre that welcomes anyone in Victoria.
Well, pirouette is a very good way to describe it, because it's thrilling and spectacular, but you do end up in pretty much the same direction as you started, doing the same.
Not always. Almost. Not when I did pirouettes.
Sometimes you fall down, right? Sometimes you fall down.
Michele, before the pandemic, we saw real contention about experts and an elite, and people not decoupling from knowledge, but not enjoying the focus of being told what to do. We've had 2 years where we have very much relied on the advice, the consensus advice of experts to keep us alive. Has there been a shift in how people are viewing expertise and literally elite knowledge due to what we've been through?
Let me answer that in another even simpler way. Since about 1983, we at Roy Morgan, I run the Roy Morgan business, have been asking people whether they agree or disagree that freedom is more important than the law. And it typically runs at about sort of 9 or 10% of people think freedom is more important than the law. Today, it's over 30%. So during COVID, this view escalated, that it just changed the way that we were thinking about freedom, security, our own rights. So that's one of the key measures. There's another one which is not related to that, but I like it anyway, and that is women should stay at home and leave running the country to men. Now, this is a question, it's the one that, yes, Stuart, it's the one that people most complain about. It's we don't get complaints from people because we ask them their income. We get outrageous complaints from people about this question. Well, it's a really important question. When I began my journey with Roy Morgan, which was straight after the University of Melbourne, about 20% of people thought women should stay at home and leave running the country to men. It then tapered off until it was only that, really small number of people, 4% or something like that. As soon as you have economic tough times, you know what? Women should stay at home and leave running the country to men. So we're back up again at around 7, 8, 9%. So some of these key measures tell us how we feel about the society that we're living in And it's not just a steady line. It responds to things that are going on. But the work that I've been, whenever you have the joy of being involved in research, you have a couple of sort of love projects. And one of the ones that I've really enjoyed working on is the research into trust, and particularly distrust. And that's probably what you're thinking about, is that what we're actually monitoring is particularly, we look at the trust in companies, we look at the trust in brands and everything that people could trust or distrust. But in particular, if we look at the government instrumentalities and all of the things associated with government, we are in a situation today of massive levels of distrust. Distrust outweighs trust to an extraordinary degree, and it's just, really on that kind of downhill. So it's very challenging. I was asked today whether, where is trust going then? Who are we looking to? If we've lost confidence and trust and we actively distrust our leaders, who are we looking to? And, it was not immediately obvious. You always see an increase in religious attendance whenever there's any kind of crisis, and we saw that, but you see that before every election. So that's not the answer. I think it's true. It is true, Gary. It comes from our surveys. It's from Roy Morgan. It's accurate. Such a bad influence, this one. His father started the business. But no, I think actually at this stage we're seeing like a gap. It's not that we've all turned to celebrities or that we've turned to bloggers or anything like that. We actually seem to be in a situation where we're all a little lost and actually looking for something.
Thank you for that. We'll dig more into distrust later. Duncan, you spoke very expansively about that connection and so much of what we're going to talk about tonight. Given that when I came here in the mid-90s, finishing year 12 was becoming standard, but far from it. The number of people in university attaining higher education, the percentage and in pure numbers, has only grown and expanded out. Shouldn't that gap have been narrowing just through society between the view of the aloofness? How have universities failed to, or what could they do proactively that we've been discussing tonight to kind of bridge that gap and realise that there is such great bounty created through this knowledge to be shared with society, even if people haven't attained those qualifications themselves?
I want to say first that the questions you ask is very, very important on surveys. And the first question, I would argue that the law is a prerequisite for freedom, so you can't put them in tension against each other. But that's another matter.
I was very young when I started in 83, Duncan.
That was just a way of deflecting the question, because that's a really hard question.
Yeah, I know.
You think it's easy, but it's not, because if I had a photographic memory and could recite to you everything that this university is currently doing in society to help society, all sorts of things that we're doing, and not just this university, of course, it would be blindingly obvious that we are fully embedded. We're doing a really good job in lots of different ways, in lots of different, all sorts of different social areas, etc., etc. But that message still doesn't quite get across. And the easy answer is that we're not good at selling our message. And of course, we can improve with that. But that's not the whole answer. There is still, I think, and I don't mean to be controversial, but amongst our especially political class, most of whom have been to university, which always confuses me, but a desire, and it's not just in this country, so it's not just tall poppy syndrome or anything like that, a desire to have a pop at these great institutions. And that's complicit in that are the journalists who report things. There have been a number of different occasions here in the last couple of years where a particular element of a fact has been blown up out of all proportion in relation to the great massive background that's going on in that particular area. I won't talk about specifics, but one quite recently happened, and it's just utterly unfair. I don't want to go on like that because everyone will start thinking I'm a whinger, and given that I'm a POM, they probably have some kind of reasonable thinking there. But we've got to find a way, I think, of continuing to press home this message very strongly that we are here to serve society. And I think in the past, and there's a legacy from that, we haven't really had that idea even, let alone given that message. I think there's been too long where, I mean, when I first got here, I picked up the book about the university, and the front cover, there was a picture of the beautiful iron railings around the university that no longer are there, incidentally. And it was called A Place Apart. They were proud of the fact that it was a place apart behind these iron railings. That's precisely the wrong thing to do, in my view. That might have been a model that was very prevalent, decades ago, and everyone accepted it in those days. But that's not what we should be. We should be the exact opposite of that. And I'm working very hard to make sure we are the exact opposite. We've just signed an important concordat with the City of Melbourne, for example, about all of the work we're doing together. We're doing a lot of work with the arts in the city. And more than the city, in the state and in the country as well. And in fact, just finally, through COVID, I had the misfortune, in a sense, of being chair of the Victorian Vice-Chancellor's Committee for the whole 2 years. And I made it an absolute mission to make sure that all of the Vice-Chancellors would turn up to our meetings and that we would meet with government every 2 weeks. So we met with government officials every 2 weeks, and ministers would come along as appropriate. And what that meant was that the government, the state government, treated us and now treats us like partners in building this great city. And so we don't go cap in hand anymore asking them for money. We go to them to discuss a joint plan to invest in something to make the city better. And through that, the universities have received a very large sum of money from the state government, who have no obligation to fund us whatsoever. And so I think that partnership model is incredibly important, and a good faith partnership, not just doing it to get some money out of them, but to understand our foundational role in this city, in this state, and in this country.
We have the education state on our number plate, and I often remind people it's not because we just educate our own students. Everyone does that. There's this bigger role to play. You talked about concrete, so let's get into kind of the infrastructure. Claire is clearly the smartest person here, because not only did she secure $1 squillion to fix the art centre, she's leaving before the jackhammers arrive, which is the best time you come back for the opening. With those changes, I know a lot of them are to do with decades of work that requires to be done, but you are in a precinct that is being exploded and rebuilt. And I know, because I worked there in the ABC, where we've endured a lot of construction and we've got a few more years ahead of us. With those physical spaces, how can we better kind of welcome people in and create what Duncan's talking about, which is a greater connectivity, not a place apart, but a place together?
Look, Melbourne, the Arts Precinct in Melbourne, I think, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of urban planning I've ever come across. Like, it was deliberate, the land was set aside, there was a really clear vision about what it was going to be and where it was going to be, and its proximity to the city and the sports precinct it's absolutely world class. You show people maps of Melbourne and they can't believe that the Arts Precinct is right there. But there is a sense when you come to it as a new person, as I did nearly 8 years ago now, that it's not quite finished. So it was built very much, with the grand institutions addressing St Kilda Road. And they're magnificent buildings, those Roy Grounds buildings really are extraordinary, but they're very much of their time. And of course, in the time since the Arts Precinct has been built, the whole suburb of Southbank has sprung up behind it. And we always make a joke that we've got our backside hanging out to Southbank, because you walk along the back of the Arts Centre, you walk past the bins and the loading dock, and it's dark and it doesn't feel safe. And yet that's the passage that a lot of people have to go to get to the ABC or the Recital Centre or the Melbourne Theatre Company. So the master planning that has gone into this work, which has been a very collaborative exercise with the state government, with the Arts Centre, with the NGV, is all about joining that precinct up and filling in the bits that are missing. So Melbourne doesn't have a large-scale contemporary art gallery. And it absolutely should. So that's what NGV Contemporary will deliver, be right opposite your building, Dan. And then the Arts Centre itself, it's been starved of good maintenance money since it was built. So there's a whole renewal piece that needs to be done. But what will join it all together is this extraordinary new public garden, 18,000 square metres of public space, that will open up those institutions and put them in the round, and connect from the river, from Hamer Hall, right down to South Bank Boulevard. So it's taking what we've got, these extraordinary assets, but making them more open, more accessible, for a contemporary audience, not the audience of the 1970s for whom they were all designed. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity to not just build new buildings or build new gardens, but to actually reimagine what those institutions are and how they sit within that space, how they sit within that precinct, how they work outside of that precinct as well. So there's a lot of programmatic rethinking going on in both the NGV and Arts Centre Melbourne at the moment, that will populate those new facilities as they're built. So it will, to me, it's about fulfilling that potential of the Melbourne Arts Precinct to make it really one of the best precincts that there is in the world. I'm biased, clearly, because I've been part of it, but it really is an extraordinary asset for Melburnians and Victorians.
If you haven't had a chance, please do look at the artist drawings of what that NGV Contemporary is going to look like. It does look spectacular, although I do wish they'd gone with my idea of putting it where the Hazelwood Power Station is, which is on a train line. It's only an hour to get out of Melbourne. Anyway, we spend a lot of money on sporting infrastructure in Melbourne. We have a similarly expansive sporting precinct. Michele, do you think we've understood, we probably talk about it more from sport, about such a driver of the economy and the value that it creates beyond money? Do we understand and encapsulate that about the arts and creativity as how much of a driver it is, particularly in this city?
Look, it's really, you're asking the wrong person when you talk about sports, but I know what you're talking about. Can I just say it's absolutely crucial what the University of Melbourne and everything to do with arts can do. That is the only way that we will get Melbourne back humming. It's just so important. And I think it will come back. I'm sure Melbourne will come back. I think it won't be this year, it won't be next year, it'll be slowly. But it won't just happen if we kind of wait for it to happen. If we just wait for stuff to happen and people to decide to come back because they don't have to wear a mask. This is the time when everyone who has some reason for inviting people back in, welcoming people in, drawing them in, it's kind of up to us to do that. So whether that's sporting activities or whether that's the arts, I mean, I live in East Melbourne. It annoys me when people go to the football because, it's just annoying and I don't really like football. So that's why I say it's the wrong thing. But it brings joy to so many people. It brings engagement to so many people. They probably went back to the MCG before they would think about going back to their office in the city. So all of those things are really important. Do we put enough, if you like, economic value on what the arts do? Probably not. It's always very difficult. I think when I see those studies, and we do some of them as well, where you're demonstrating the economic value of anything, you know that it's for a particular purpose. But you have to say Melbourne became successful because of our focus on the arts. I mean, I remember being taken into Steve Crabb's office many years ago, the late 80s. And he was the tourism person then, and I was a very young researcher, and he said, well, we have to make Melbourne the centre. We need to get people coming into Victoria. And I'm thinking, gosh, why would they come to Melbourne? It's raining, there's no beach, and I'm thinking, I'll try my best, but what a hard gig for my first research gig. And he said, Michele, don't think about it as tourism. Don't think about it as holidays. This is about money into the state. This is about our economy. It's all about that. And it was just like a light bulb went off in my head, and I realised that what it was all about was understanding people who spend money and getting them to spend their money in Melbourne. And do you know what those people did? They didn't go surfing. They weren't going to Bali on holidays. They went to the theatre. They ate out at restaurants. They went to galleries. They did the kind of holiday activities which were about learning. So these were the people that in those days we sought to attract. And the arts, that sort of central arts thing, was a critical part of it, as was the university. And that's how we saw Melbourne growing and growing in terms of brilliance, in terms of our ability to attract holidaymakers as a destination that everyone wanted to go to on the back of that. So, it's the way to go. And let me just say, anything about elitism or people being excluded for any reason today is not on. I mean, it never should have been on. It should always be inclusive of all kinds. We have all sorts of things today where we talk about diversity and those kinds of things. They're real. They're not just boxes to tick. If you don't have diversity on your board, diversity of thought, you will inadvertently exclude people. If you have diversity of thought, you'll be kind of welcoming them all in. And that's what we need. That's what Melbourne needs. And you can have some footy as well if you must.
Yes, sorry for parking on your front lawn. Duncan, before we move on from concrete, because everyone needs a hobby, you're on the board of one of our biggest companies, CSL, and they're building their new headquarters on the city side of the Haymarket roundabout, bringing that biotech precinct, dragging it back towards the city. Through the amazing space, and I do hope people have had a chance to see it on Grattan Street in Swanston, with the new science gallery and the kind of maker space and really open spaces available to people through the university. These projects take a long time, and pouring the concrete and planning takes a really great span of time. As you plan these new developments that take this long span, how are you seeking to connect with the communities around them as well as welcoming people into them?
I think that's a very important issue. The current big project that we've got on the go remains Fisherman's Bend, and I had a meeting this afternoon about that. It's still happening, despite the financial stress we've been under. We're still talking to government about it. We're very lucky with Fisherman's Bend because there aren't many people who live down there, so it's kind of we're consulting obviously, but it's not a big deal. I wasn't here when Melbourne Connect was first envisaged, of course, but I know that the community was consulted about that, and I think that's an incredibly important issue. The local community around there. There's another important issue with Melbourne Connect, which is that it's built on the site of the Women's Hospital. And Marcia's in the room, she was there on the day. When we opened Melbourne Connect, we had a very special smoking and cleansing ceremony because of the many people have had very happy experiences in the Women's Hospital, and there have been quite a few people, mostly Indigenous people, who had terrible experiences in there. So there was a cleansing ceremony there, which was an extremely important, moving moment for me. So that's another kind of consultation, I suppose, but it's not really consultation. Those matters should be central to consideration of those kinds of things. And of course, we have all of the spaces at Melbourne Connect now named with Indigenous words as well. And I think that there's a lot of different elements to reconciliation, but that concrete, if I may, reconciliation, visible concrete reconciliation is an important, if small, part of it too. So there's all sorts of different consultation that you do with these kinds of projects. At the moment, we are, of course, you may have seen in the papers, in the middle of trying to get the Australian Institute of Infectious Diseases off the ground. We the Victorian government have put a large sum of 400 million into the budget to help us with that. And we are out fundraising for that at the moment in different ways as well. That's another issue in terms of consulting with our people, consulting with other science institutes around the country. There's a broader consultation there as well, so it's not just about the locals who are living there. But all of that's incredibly important to get right if you want to be a good citizen in the world.
Constant change, flux. I want to ask each of you a question about that. I'll start with you, Clarence, we're going this way. Melbourne will, particularly can't we look at the cultural spaces that we're building and that kind of thing, it will never be finished. Are we okay with that?
I think we have to be. I don't think we have a choice. I think we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that things are maintenance free, which I think every performing arts centre in the world has fallen into that trap. These buildings have to be maintained, but they also need to be renewed. As the community changes, as our city starts to look different. And for us, as artistic practice changes, we need to keep changing and evolving. So I don't think it will ever be done and finished.
We spoke, I think, I always congratulate people when they come out because I appear on the news, and honestly, if you watched it every night, I would just keep the doona up and probably not leave the house. When you talk to people, Michele, you talk to a lot of people, how much emotional weight can they carry of what's happened in the past few years? How are they coming out of that now? Obviously, there's a focus on this in that there will be a federal election very soon where people are going to make a really substantial judgment on essentially the track of the country, right track, wrong track, and how things are for them. When you take the pulse of people who have gone through all this change, particularly in the last 2 years, what do they tell you?
Look, it's not a gradual thing where everyone's got a little more fearful. It's not just like the temperature gradually going up like that. And you've got people who have actually stayed at home under the doona and really won't come out. And you've got people who have been, just desperate to get out. They're just going crazy. One of the things that's really interesting, in watching old English TV programs, they would often, you remember them? They would often say...
Still watch them, I don't know how to remember them.
But they would often say about, Mrs. Jones or something, and she never left the house after the war. You often hear that phrase, and I'd listen to it and it didn't mean anything. I just thought, oh yeah, she doesn't go out much. I'm now, having been through COVID, I think these women probably didn't leave the house after the war. It was such a horrific experience. They became so frightened, they literally didn't. And we at Roy Morgan have some young project managers who have not yet left the house. And some of them have families that they have put themselves in isolation from the day that we were told to go into, lockdown and haven't come out. That's one extreme. And then you have the other extreme of people who, refuse to believe that COVID is even real and they're desperately wanting to come back to work. And we've got people in the office who don't want them back at work because they're not vaccinated. So there's a whole range of things. But I think what we must all be finding is that we just can't assume that things are the way that they were. Everything has slowed down. I mean, there's certain things that have got faster, things like it's a bit easier to buy your shopping online and those sorts of things. It's slower to have things delivered. But, the discussions that we're hearing now about things like productivity haven't even really begun to bite. Most things you go to do today involving the government or involving a corporation actually take a lot longer because people are away, they're remote, there's a loss in connectivity. The Great Resignation is about people thinking, what's this all about? Why do I want to go back and work there? I can do something different. Then they go somewhere and they can't connect. So the fallout of this disconnection that we've all been through has a lot to still play out. I mean, we at Roy Morgan are absolutely committed to doing face-to-face interviewing with people in their homes. You know where you are. You know that you're talking to a human being. You can tell whether they're telling the truth. Everything about it is just so wonderful. We can't do that kind of face-to-face interviewing across Australia at the moment, really, because not everyone is willing to answer the door. Not everyone is happy to do that. So I just feel that it's for all of us in business, in leadership, in any way, we have to go back to basic principles on everything. and kind of just not assume stuff's going to happen. Nothing can be assumed at the moment.
Duncan, one of the hard parts I find about these conversations is that people at this level love change. They eat change. They take jobs overseas. They move around the world for exciting opportunities. A lot of people don't like change. In fact, I would suggest a lot. How do you make people comfortable in the river? You know, to walk in with you. I mean, you have a huge workforce. You go to a lot of meetings with a lot of people. Many of them love change. They love pushing it. No, yeah. But how do you make people comfortable to join you in the river?
I think that's almost the definition of leadership in a way. So to Michele's point, I think there are people who are the victims of circumstance, and then there are people who make things happen, if you like. And so in the post-COVID situation we find ourselves in, you can just say it's all changed and we're going to have to find a new way of doing it, or you can say I don't like the way it's changed. I rather like some of the stuff we had before. It's my job as a leader to go out there and say to people, I want you in the office, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be, because, this virus is under control. We've got vaccines and, well, that's what I'm doing now, yeah.
Good on you.
And,
did it a few months
I think, there are some people who really don't like me saying that. But again, you don't do these leadership roles to be loved, and so you have to get out there and you say what you think and you try and work through that. So I think, that's an element of the answer to your question. I think also there is if you extend the Heraclitus kind of metaphor, you can help people understand who don't like change that there is constant change around them, but still the river's there. There is some constancy there as well. There's always a sort of foundational constancy about some of these things. So there's different rates of change. A lot of people who think they don't like change have been dealing with slow change all the time, and they love it. Many of those people will be very happy using these bloody mobile phone things, right? And getting all their shopping delivered to them on the internet and everything else. Well, that's change. Okay, so people who say they don't like change, actually they're coping with change all of the time. You just have to help them through it, I think, especially in a leadership position. And then when there's rapid change to be done, I think it helps to be, it's almost my mantra, you've got to be honest, you've got to have high integrity, and you've got to make decisions. And if people don't like those decisions, you can try and explain that to them. But ultimately, you've got to carry the can and try to make sure that you enact those difficult decisions and hope, beyond hope, that they're the right decisions and get the institution or whatever it is you're doing through the bad, rapid change time.
I'll wrap up with a question on the CBD story and our place within it and what we're going to do. But before we get to that, Ben, do you have a handheld mic? If anyone would like to ask a question, please do get Ben's attention, and I'll put it to the panel. We spoke earlier about trust and distrust. A lot of, obviously I'm here representing the media, so I'll apologise on behalf of it for all the things we've done, many of which I think have not been particularly helpful. 24-hour news, I don't know if it's a good idea. But anyway, there has been a decline of trust in large institutions. We only have to look at the kind of Royal Commission into religious orders and sexual abuse, the Banking Royal Commission I covered, some of these big declines. You're someone who works in the field of hope, of the creation of joy. How much does trust come into that? How much do you have to create trust, first of all, in the past, while for making people feel safe to come back? And how much can you draw on trust to make good things happen?
Yeah, look, I think, how long have we got? I think just addressing that first point about, giving people real confidence to come back. We have been communicating with our audiences right the way through COVID, and not in a sophisticated way like you do, but, just taking the temperature. Can you say that now? Probably not. But understanding what's important to them. And what we were hearing was that things like, really visible cleaning and staff wearing appropriate PPE, appropriate social distancing, Like those things in their moment were really important. And so we heard that and we responded to that. So, you know, suddenly all our cleaners started wearing high-vis vests so that everyone could see that we were taking cleaning really seriously. So there was that sort of really listening and being curious and not assuming that customers and artists as well actually felt the same as they did pre-COVID, and trying to be responsive to that. But I think there's another aspect of trust for us, which is about having the courage to put different stories on stages and in our galleries, and being prepared to court controversy, being prepared to allow different stories to be told, different perspectives to be shared, and to do that without judgment, always being clear what you're buying, literally what you're buying into, but not being afraid to bring those stories to the stage. And I think, you know, the artist community has really suffered through COVID. It really has. So, but I think as we move into the recovery period, we will start to see more stories about this time coming out. And I think we have to have the courage to do that. We have to be brave to have those conversations, and listen to artists. I don't know what your surveys are saying, but I think you can always trust an artist to tell the truth. You may not agree with their perspective, but be curious about what they're saying and try and tap into that story.
Thank you. Michele, we saw after the Banking Royal Commission a shattering of trust in these very large institutions that people use. Last year, the Commonwealth Bank was the most trusted brand in Australia by acting quickly ahead of the government to pause loans and things like that as the pandemic hit. When you look at trust and distrust in large institutions, in the political process itself, is there an ability to turn that around?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. And one of the things when our clients talk to us, they say, how do we rebuild trust? And we basically say, look, you can't even begin to rebuild trust until you've got rid of or, you know, put down the level of distrust that you have. And at the time that coming out of the Royal Inquiry or the banking financial inquiry, everyone was, you know, we were angry. We felt totally betrayed by these banks. We just couldn't believe what had been going on. I mean, we knew they had to make money, and we kind of, you know, we loved bashing banks. We always have. But this was another level of dishonesty and you know, we really felt foolish to have trusted too much. That's where we were. Now, had the banks said, oh, how are we going to build some trust? Let's support some kids' footy teams. Let's go out and have a shelter for poor people, or you know, that would have been seen as we would have seen it cynically. We would have said that's just outrageous, you know. But what in fact happened is that COVID created the opportunity for the narrative changed. People were talking about COVID, not the banks. But really, most importantly, the individual banks were able to do the right thing at a time when people needed them to give them a mortgage holiday, reduce their mortgage rates, help them with their phone bills, or whatever financial help was needed. The banks actually were there. And so what we've seen in our data, and this is not just like one survey, this is a continuous stream of data coming in from people. We've actually seen that people have increasingly trusted specific banks. But when you ask them, who do you trust, who do you distrust, they distrust banks in general, all the banks. So what we've got is a situation where, you know, banks are bad, but the Commonwealth Bank, they've got a fantastic app, and I can see everything that I absolutely need. And, you know, NAB was terrific. Now they've got that new bloke in. So at an individual level, they're actually rebuilding trust very seriously. Of course, they did what was quite important, a bit of a cleansing of their own. They got rid of most of the people at the top. So, you know, a lot of work was done there. It is possible. That's what political parties do too, sometimes.
We'll see what happens. We've run out of time for questions on the impact of the CBD and the opportunities that are there. We'll have time for that in our mingling and drinks straight afterwards. But I want to give all of you a chance for a final thought. I'll start with you, Duncan, and then come back. Never waste a crisis. What's the opportunity that we have to be grasped?
Opportunity what?
That we can grasp.
To grasp, you said, yes, sorry. Well, I think actually COVID has been a catalyst in the true sense of the word. Catalyst is something that takes two chemicals that won't normally react together and helps them to react together much more quickly. And I think that's what we've had in the university. We've a whole bunch of stuff that we were thinking about doing, which was taking a million years to get through all the committees and consultation and everything else. We had to just do. So in 2 weeks, we went from face-to-face teaching to online. And we've been vacillating about doing online teaching for a very long time, you know. And so that's a very interesting thing. Now we've got to wind that back a bit, actually, because actually all of these committees are very useful in terms of getting it right. So, you know, but I think that there's been a catalytic effect on all those kinds of things. And it's almost like an oscillator. As we come out of COVID, we've got to make sure we dampen it down to the right place and get to the right level of the various different things that we're doing now. In terms of the city, I'm very hopeful about the city of Melbourne. I think Claire's absolutely right. If anyone doubts, incidentally, in the room, the value of arts and humanities teaching in the university, I'm sure nobody does in this room, but the rhetoric coming out of government recently about arts and humanities, cancelling research grants and denigrating teaching, now's the time when we need the arts and humanities more than anything, and that's the opportunity to be grasped as well. Who's going to write the history of this period? How fascinating is that going to be? Who's going to explore the ethics and philosophy of freedom versus the law? Where is the next generation of great artists coming from who are going to capture this momentous moment in the world's history? So important for people to relate to and understand and get over these kinds of things. That's just economics, all of the different things that we need. So I think we should have a big push and a big campaign to grasp the moment to big up the arts and humanities as well as the sciences in this moment in time.
Duncan, a fantastic encapsulation. Michele, your final thought?
I agree with what Duncan was saying about the ability to get things done quickly. We did research among a whole range of businesses during COVID, and that was a constant cry, is that things that they'd been talking about wanting to do, but the contract was a bit too tight and they couldn't do things, contracts were thrown away and people did stuff. So that was an amazing thing that happened during COVID. We saw what we could really do. That's fantastic. The concern I have, and maybe I'm just getting too old, but I see that we have been moved very much faster than we ever expected into the digital world, into the world of virtual reality. Every time you're on a Zoom call or something like that and you don't really see somebody's background, you see spaceships or something or other, it's kind of virtual reality, it's not real. So that concerns me enormously. I don't think we've really truly understood or kept up in our understanding of the impact of this connection between man, machine, reality, virtual reality. So, study that.
That's a pretty interdisciplinary project.
It is. It's where I started at the University of Melbourne, so there you go. Back again. Never went away.
Claire, you're off on a big adventure when you are back in front of the Sugden Institute. What do you want to see to have occurred in the intervening period since you've been away?
Look, what I'd like to say, you're all clearly very influential Melburnians. I would love to say, please support your artists. They've had a really, really hard couple of years. Go to the theatre, go to the galleries. If you've got property in the city, hand it over to an artist. Let them be part of the recovery of the city and the CBD. Take your friends, take your kids, take your grandkids, but please just support the arts here. We really need it to get through this period.
Fantastic. Thank you all for your thoughts. Thank you for your time. Please join me in welcoming us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for leading us in such an interesting conversation this evening. I think one of the things that I take away and to be taught history by a scientist, I think is a wonderful thing. I used to actually run a Centre for the Study of Science, History and Society. And I think it's important that we keep these interdisciplinary conversations going. But that long view of history, I think, that Duncan, you shared with us is an important one, and it actually reflects our motto, Edificamus in Aeternum, that we're building for eternity. And I think we need to keep these things before us, that there is this long view. There may be a nuclear war, nuclear holocaust of some kind, as you said, hopefully not. But we will come through this COVID episode. We do need people then to reflect on it, as I think we've heard. We need our artists, we need our historians, we need our philosophers. And I guess one of my frustrations and one of the things that we would be trying to do through the Sugden Institute is that I think sometimes our politicians haven't seen that, as you said. They definitely haven't seen it. And they're not prepared to bring all the expertise together in order to address these issues. So political decisions are made without being informed decisions from the different disciplines that could actually help them, whether it be the social sciences, the arts, the dramatic arts, music, even the sciences. And it's unfortunate that politicians are not with us this evening. Our former Deputy Prime Minister had a broken shoulder, and unfortunately our fellow Brian Howe couldn't be here, and our contemporary politicians had to call off because they're working. But I think a lot of the hope actually lies also in what was said about the importance of people operating city to city in that international way, and not always state to state or nation to nation. I think nationhood is often overdone as we look at the history of the world, and has caused more problems. And I say this as a Scot, has caused more problems than solutions sometimes. We need the people to people. So I think we've heard some of that this evening. Certainly for this college, important things for us as a community are actually to emphasise the things that Melbourne does in terms of academic excellence, in terms of our community not only being inward looking, and we do have a fence and we do have gates, but to be looking out to the world and to be giving back. I think we heard a little bit about that with someone like Sam Pizar, who went back and did a wonderful job internationally, and lots of our alumni from the university and from this college have done that, to emphasise the importance of reconciliation and diversity, in particular in learning, the importance of sustainability, but most of all the importance of good leadership and not being afraid to actually make these decisions that will make a difference, but everyone won't be happy with, but are important things for us to do. So I'd like to thank our panel once again this evening, to thank Dan, and to just ask people to take this flyer away with them, advertising our next major event on the 11th of May, which will be our Indigenous oration. Professor Marcia Langton actually gave the first Indigenous oration, and we'll welcome back Professor Sean Ewan, who was supposed to speak last year, but is now at Griffith University to come and reflect. Again, I think he might be reflecting on the importance of place, but from a particular perspective. We also have within a number this evening Professor Peter Holbrook, who will be our Sugden Fellow in second semester, and will actually speak about Shakespeare. And very fitting, again, given Sugden's interest in Shakespeare. The other things that we're planning, there may be some other events added, but to look at climate, to look at youth mental health, which has certainly been an issue over the past couple of years, the importance of philanthropy in addressing some of the issues that we've been talking about tonight, the impact of social media, which again I think has been touched on, and we've got a number of book launches coming up. So it's wonderful to see everyone here. Look forward to being able to invite you back to Queen's to some of these events, and we can now enjoy some conversation and drinks and some canapes together. But please, once again, join me in thanking everyone.